Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're heading to Victorian London,
Ooh, Victorian London.
but not to the fancy parts.
Mm.
You know, the drawing rooms and the balls.
Right.
We're going to the underbelly, the grimy streets, the forgotten corners.
Sounds a bit more Dickens than Austen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our guide is none other than Reverend Charles Maurice Davies.
A clergyman.
You heard right. He wrote this book in 1877 called Mystic London, and it's a fascinating peek into the parts of the city most people wouldn't dare to explore.
Now that's a contrast I wouldn't have expected. A man of the cloth delving into the dark side of London.
It really makes you think, what was he looking for? What did he find? And that's what we're going to dig into today.
I'm intrigued already. Let's dive in.
So one group that really caught Davies' attention was the city's destitute children.
Ah, those poor kids struggling to survive.
Davies called them London Arabs.
London Arabs, that's a striking term.
It is, right?
Yeah.
And it conjures up images of nomadic tribes far away in the desert.
Yeah, it definitely creates a sense of otherness, like these children were a separate world within London itself.
And Davies doesn't hold back on the details. He describes seeing them huddled in doorways, barefoot clutching greasy slates, their faces smudged with dirt.
He really paints a vivid picture.
He does. And he actually compares the areas where these children lived, places like Charles Street and King Street, to Arabia in Felix and Arabia Petraea.
Those are ancient regions known for their harshness and desolation.
Yeah, I had to look them up too. It's like Davies is saying, it wasn't just poverty, it was a whole other level of hardship right here in London.
He's using those metaphors to really drive home the scale of the problem, the sheer number of children living in these desperate conditions.
It definitely makes an impact. And he goes on to describe these children as being constantly drawn to the excitement of the theater.
The theater, in
Yep.
the midst of all that poverty.
I know, right? It seems like a world away, but for these kids, it was an escape, a glimpse of something magical.
I can imagine it being a powerful pull.
Davies even mentions this scene in A Ragged School.
Ragged schools.
They were these charitable efforts to provide basic education to poor children.
Okay, makes sense.
So he's in this ragged school, and the teacher is struggling to keep the kids' attention because they're so distracted by the attractions of the theater and the occasional intrusion of wild Arabs who came only to kick up a row.
So even with these good intentions, even with people trying to help, it sounds like a chaotic situation.
Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And it highlights this bigger context. These ragged schools were often underfunded, overcrowded, and struggling to meet the needs of these children.
It makes you wonder how much of a difference they could really make.
Exactly, were they just scratching the surface?
And it reflects this broader debate happening at the time, about the role of government versus private charity and tackling poverty.
Like, who was responsible for helping these kids?
Right. Should the state step in, or was it up to philanthropists and religious organizations? It's a tension that continues to this day.
So even back then, they were wrestling with these big questions. It's interesting to see how much hasn't changed.
Absolutely. So what else did Davies find? What other ways were people trying to help these London Arabs?
Well, he takes us on a tour of different institutions popping up across London. He talks about soup kitchens providing a basic meal to the hungry,
Always essential.
and refuges offering shelter to those who had nowhere to go,
A roof over your head, a place to feel safe.
and also workshops trying to teach these children trades so they could maybe make a living for themselves.
So a real mix of approaches. It sounds like they were trying everything they could think of.
It does. But the question is, were they effective?
Ah, the million-dollar question. And I bet Davies has some thoughts on that.
He does. He seems to have a lot of admiration for the people running these institutions.
Yeah.
Many of them were working with tiny budgets, relying on volunteers just trying to make a difference.
Their hearts were in the right place.
Absolutely. But he also hints at the limitations of these efforts.
Like they could only do so much.
He describes visiting this one place called the St. George's and St. Giles's Refuge, where they housed, clothed, and taught trades to 154 boys.
That's incredible. So many lives touched by one place.
But then he adds this detail. He says that another 20 boys were sleeping on the floor because there wasn't enough room.
Oh, wow. So even with all that effort, they were still overwhelmed by the sheer number of children in need.
It really paints a stark picture of the challenges they were facing. And it gets to the heart of this bigger issue, right? Charity, while essential, can only go so far.
Like you're treating the symptoms, but not the disease.
Exactly. The root causes of poverty, the lack of education, the unemployment, the inadequate housing, all those things remained largely unaddressed.
It's a complex problem with no easy solutions.
And that brings us to this key figure in Davies's account, a woman named Miss McPherson who ran something called the Home of Industry.
Miss McPherson, what made her stand out?
Well, she seems to have shared Davies' belief that charity wasn't enough. She recognized the need for a more radical solution, something that went beyond just providing temporary relief.
She was thinking bigger picture, trying to break the cycle of poverty.
Exactly. She envisioned giving these children a chance at a whole new life.
Now, that's a bold idea. I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, her plan was to send these London Arabs to Canada, to a land where they could find opportunities that simply didn't exist for them in London.
Canada. That's a huge leap of faith. Sending these kids across the ocean to a completely unknown world.
It was a gamble, for sure, and Davies doesn't shy away from the magnitude of it all. He describes this incredible departure scene. 100 boys, many of whom had never ventured beyond their own neighborhood setting sail from St. Pancras Station.
Can you imagine the mix of emotions, the excitement, the fear, the hope?
It must have been overwhelming. And they were accompanied by a group of women who volunteered to shepherd them across the Atlantic.
Wow, talk about courage. These women were stepping into the unknown right alongside those boys.
They were. And Davies actually includes excerpts from letters written by these women during the voyage.
Really? That's fascinating. What kind of insights do they offer?
Well, they describe the boys as being eager to learn, surprisingly well-behaved, and full of a kind of resilience that had been forged in the crucible of poverty.
So despite all they'd been through, they still had this spark, this hope for something better.
One letter even mentions that the boys were as obedient as a company of soldiers while on board this ship.
That's high praise, considering the circumstances.
It is right, and it makes you wonder if being removed from the chaos and temptations of London actually had a positive effect on them. Like it allowed a sense of discipline and purpose to emerge.
It's an interesting thought, but it's also important to remember that we're seeing this journey through the eyes of adults who were invested in the success of this experiment.
That's a good point. We don't really know how the boys themselves experienced this massive upheaval in their lives.
It would be fascinating to hear their side of the story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Davies doesn't give us access to their voices, but we can piece together some clues from his account. He describes the reception the boys received upon arriving in Canada, and it seems to have been overwhelmingly positive.
Really? So they were welcomed with open arms?
It seems so. He quotes newspaper reports describing the boys as hardy-looking chaps fit for any toil.
That sounds a bit patronizing to modern ears. But I guess it was meant as a compliment at the time.
It was. And this perception of them as strong, capable workers was crucial to their acceptance in Canadian society.
Because Canada needed manpower, there were young nations still developing, and there was a lot of work to be done.
And less of a rigid class structure than in England.
So these boys had a chance to create a new life for themselves without the same social barriers they faced back in London.
Precisely. Davies mentions farmers in Toronto practically crowding the platform, eager to employ the boys. There's even an anecdote about a gentleman traveling all the way from Hamilton with 60 applications for boys to work on his farm.
Wow, they were in demand.
It's a stark contrast to how they were treated in London, where they were often seen as a nuisance or a threat to public order.
It makes you wonder, did sending these children overseas really solve the problem of poverty, or did it just shift the burden elsewhere?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And Davies doesn't provide easy answers.
He doesn't. But he does offer a glimpse into the complexities of social reform and the challenges of trying to balance individual compassion with systemic change.
And speaking of complexities, let's not forget that while some of these London Arabs were finding new opportunities in Canada, Davies returned to London to find countless others still trapped in poverty.
A sobering reminder that even the most well-intentioned efforts can feel like a drop in the ocean when faced with the vastness of social problems.
It makes you wonder, were these reforms like Miss McPherson's program truly effective? Or were they just a temporary bandage on a much deeper wound?
That's a question that Davies grapples with throughout his book. And while he doesn't offer any definitive conclusions, he does force us to confront the limitations of charity and the need for more systemic solutions to address the root causes of poverty.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from Davies' exploration of Victorian London and these early attempts to tackle child poverty?
I think it comes down to this idea of opportunity, right? Like, these children were stuck in the cycle of poverty in London with no way out.
And Canada represented this fresh start, this chance to break free.
Yeah, a place where hard work could actually lead to a better life, where their background didn't automatically determine their future.
So it was about more than just physical relocation. It was about social mobility, too.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how Davies frames this whole endeavor. He presents it as a sort of grand experiment.
Mm.
Can these children from the slums of London adapt and thrive in a completely different environment?
It's like a real-life social experiment unfolding before our eyes.
Exactly. And to his credit, Davies doesn't shy away from the complexities. He acknowledges that it's a risky proposition sending these kids across the ocean to a place they know nothing about.
But he also seems to be cautiously optimistic.
I think there's a sense of hope there, right? This belief that these children, despite their circumstances, have the potential to make something of themselves.
And that brings us back to those letters from the women who accompanied the boys on the voyage.
Those firsthand accounts are so valuable, they give us a glimpse into what it was actually like on that journey.
One thing that struck me was how often they mentioned the boys' eagerness to learn.
Really? Like they were hungry for knowledge.
It seems that way. One letter describes how the boys would spend hours poring over books and asking endless questions.
Wow, so they were taking full advantage of this opportunity to educate themselves.
And it wasn't just about academics either. The women also observed a transformation in the boys' behavior.
Like they were becoming more disciplined, more responsible.
Exactly. One woman writes about how the boys started taking pride in their appearance, keeping their clothes neat and tidy, and helping out with chores on the ship.
That's interesting. It's like this sense of structure and purpose had a positive effect on them.
And there's this recurring theme of resilience. These boys had faced so much hardship, but they still had this spark, this determination to make something better of their lives.
It's inspiring, really. It speaks to the strength of the human spirit.
And I think it's important to acknowledge the courage of those women who chose to accompany these boys on such a perilous journey.
They were pioneers in their own right, leaving behind everything they knew to embark on this grand adventure.
They put their faith in these children and their ability to adapt and thrive in a new world.
And they played a crucial role in shaping their experience, providing guidance and support along the way.
So what happened when these London Arabs finally reached Canada? Were they welcomed with open arms?
That's the big question, right? Did this experiment actually work? Well, according to Davies, the reception was overwhelmingly positive.
Really? So they weren't seen as, a burden on society?
It seems not. Davies actually quotes newspaper reports from the time describing the boys as, hardy-looking chaps fit for any toil.
Hardy-looking chaps fit for any toil. It does sound a bit, I don't know, condescending maybe to modern ears.
Yeah, it definitely reflects a different time and a different way of thinking about social class.
But I guess in the context of 19th century Canada, those were seen as positive attributes.
Exactly. Canada was a young nation still developing. There's a huge demand for labor, particularly in agriculture.
And these boys were seen as, strong and willing to work.
Precisely, Davies talks about farmers in Toronto practically lining up to employ these boys.
So they were actually seen as an asset.
In many ways, yes. Their arrival was seen as a boon to the local economy.
And it's such a stark contrast to how they were perceived in London.
Right, where they were often viewed as a problem, a drain on resources.
It makes you think about the power of perspective and how our social context shapes the way we view those in need.
Absolutely. And it raises some tough questions, too, like, did sending these children to Canada truly solve the problem of poverty? Or did it just shift the burden elsewhere?
That's a really good point. I mean, were these boys really given a fair chance at a new life? Or were they simply exploited as cheap labor in a new land?
Those are questions that Davies grapples with throughout his book, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
He doesn't shy away from the complexities, does he?
Not at all. He presents this nuanced view of social reform, acknowledging both the good intentions and the potential pitfalls.
And let's not forget that while some of these London Arabs were finding new opportunities in Canada, Davies returned to London to find countless others still struggling to survive.
It's a sobering reminder that even with the best efforts, poverty is a deeply entrenched problem with no quick fixes.
So what do we take away from all of this? What can we learn from Davies' exploration of Victorian London and these early attempts to address child poverty?
I think one of the key takeaways is that charity, while essential, can only go so far.
Like it's not enough to just treat the symptoms.
Exactly. We need to address the root causes of poverty, the systemic issues that perpetuate inequality.
And that requires a shift in perspective, right? A willingness to see those in need, not as burdens, but as individuals with their own unique talents and aspirations.
Absolutely. And it's about creating opportunities for social mobility, providing pathways for people to lift themselves out of poverty.
So it's a complex issue with no easy solutions. But I think Davies' work serves as a powerful reminder that we have a responsibility to keep striving for a more just and equitable society.
And to never lose sight of the human stories behind these social problems.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of the London Arabs.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've explored the dark underbelly of Victorian London, witnessed the challenges of social reform, and grappled with some tough questions about poverty and opportunity.
And hopefully we've sparked some curiosity in our listeners, inspiring them to delve deeper into this fascinating chapter of history.
And to remember that history isn't just about the past, it's a lens through which we can understand the present and shape the future.
Beautifully put. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.